let's introduce our speaker, Trisha Coates. So Trisha Coates grew up in New Hampshire, riding horses, walking wooded trails, and collecting shells along the Atlantic coastline. The constant search for the perfect rock, undiscovered bones in the woods, or elusive blue sea glass informs the work she makes today. She received her BFA in art with an emphasis in ceramics from the University of New Hampshire. In 2012, she relocated to Wichita to study at Wichita State University, where she received her MFA in ceramics. She is currently the art department chair and an instructor of ceramics at Butler Community College in El Dorado, Kansas. She has exhibited work throughout the country, including the Holter Museum of Art, the San Angelo Museum of Art, and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. She has held residencies at Watershed Center for the Arts, Truro Center for the Arts, and the Hambridge Center. She currently lives in Wichita with her husband, son, and 2 adorable rescue dogs. Let's welcome Trisha Coates.
Awesome, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay before I get started? Yeah, okay, awesome. Okay, so to start, I want to share a phrase with you that was shared by me way back in undergrad by my first ceramic mentor, Marvin Sweet. He spent time studying in China and Japan and carried with him this phrase, ichi-go, ichi-e, which essentially means one time and one meeting. And it encourages us to cherish any gathering or event because it's truly unrepeatable. This phrase reminds me to be present and to appreciate the present because it is really, truly once in a lifetime. This way of thinking has come back to me time and time again over the years, and I think about it a lot when I make my work. So in that spirit, thank you for allowing me to share my work tonight with you in this space and over in the Epping Gallery. Okay, deep breath, let's go. Okay, so this first slide is the result of me mind mapping out my work. And it closely resembles what the inside of my brain looks like when I am making in my studio. So my goal this evening is to organize and deliver this information in a clear, concise 40-minute lecture, TBD. So I thought it might be helpful to kind of break this mind map into a few categories that would help kind of communicate and translate how I make my work, and maybe more importantly, why I make the work that I do. But before I dive into the work, I want to give you a little bit of my background. Okay. So like Haley said, I was born in New Hampshire and I lived there until I was a teenager. And for those of you who have spent any time in New England, you know that it's a really specific kind of environment. It has the White Mountains, which are part of the Appalachian Trail. It has lots of wooded trails. It has 13 whole whopping miles of coastline and has really dramatic seasonal changes. So I grew up riding horses, taking day trips to the coast, hiking mountains, and like a lot of kids in the 80s, having way too much freedom. My biological father is a grave digger, and he runs his own monument company. And he started digging graves shortly after I was born, and soon after started a monument company as well. And he started his company with just a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and up until recently actually dug most of the graves by hand, which I'm always impressed by. And I would spend time with him when I was younger, tagging along to the cemeteries while he would dig or fill in the graves. Cemeteries are still one of my very happy places, and New England has the best cemeteries. And it really has a legacy for stone carving and monument making. So this is not me, this is my son. When he was younger and we were living back east, we also lived right next door to a cemetery, so we would spend lots of time there. And sometimes our cat would join us on our walks. When I was 6, my mother married a funeral director, and we moved into an old 3-story Victorian home that had a barn on the left, complete with bats that would sometimes get into the house. The funeral parlor was on the main floor, so on the left side in the barn was where the office was, and the embalming room and the casket showroom. On the right-hand side was the funeral parlor where they would hold the funerals and the calling hours, And that little middle part was the kitchen, and it had our TV room, and it had the dining room, and then we lived on the second and third story upstairs. And that was my room, up on the very top third story of that old Victorian house. I have really vivid memories of sitting in the kitchen, having my bowl of cereal in the morning, and the casket would come rolling through the kitchen on its way to the funeral parlor. And when funerals were going on, this was still our home, so we had to be very quiet and not make any noise while the funerals were taking place downstairs. I would play Barbies and My Little Pony out in the parlor because they loved all the flowers that would be out there during the funerals. My stepbrother and I would spend time in the casket showroom, like picking out what caskets that we wanted to be buried in if we were to pass away, like you do. So growing up, I was just constantly surrounded by this like memento mori aesthetic. And I think there are a lot of things from childhood that really inform how you are as an adult, but I really think these kinds of environments started to inform the work that I made as I got older. It really reinforced this idea that life is fleeting. So I started making work that really celebrated the present moment, even if it was mundane, and maybe even like especially if it was mundane. So because I think the majority of you guys in here are students, I wanted to start by sharing a little bit of the work that I made in undergrad and a few years beyond. So it was this work and under kind of the mentorship of Marvin that really catapulted me into this creative life and ultimately led to making ceramic work that started to engage more conceptual ideas. In my 20s, I fell in love with two things, poetry and food. And my husband's in the audience, and I just want to put the caveat out there that I had already fallen in love with and married him. So just to put that out there. But I was inspired by poetry's ability to so beautifully and succinctly celebrate these mundane moments. And I was also really getting into cooking at the time. And both of these hobbies I still really actively pursue today. So during my senior year, I encountered a Lucille Clifton poem called Cutting Greens. And it talked about the interconnectedness of all living things. And at the time, I was a vessel maker. And so I became inspired to make these sculptural teapots that used certain ingredients or celebrated certain meals. They were a way to celebrate food and recipes and dinners with friends that would both literally and metaphorically become a part of us. The tea ceremony and teaware have a really rich tradition and history with community and ritual, and it seemed fitting that this would be the vessel that I would choose to kind of explore this line of thinking. And so while the works are functional, they all have that interior space. They will hold water. There are spouts that you could pour the tea out of. They're really more meant to hold your thoughts and not really meant to pour a cup of tea and serve tea. The poet Baron Wormser is quoted as saying, "To make feeling tangible must be why poetry exists." And I really connect with this quote, and kind of despite the themes and the subject matter that my work has engaged over the years, this phrase right here has always been my North Star. So those of you that have helped me haul my very heavy and cumbersome work over the years, and a lot of you are out in the audience right now, I see some, fist bumps. You probably have heard me say, in my next life, I want to come back as a poet. And that's not just because the work is really heavy and cumbersome to carry, but I really love poetry's succinctness and the ability to translate human emotional experience into words. And I think at the end of the day, that's my goal as well, but in the physical realm. So I'm really hoping to make physical, visual poetry. Okay, so on to the work. So my husband likes to joke that my work is really like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. And I feel like maybe I should just leave it at that, because sometimes the work can be talked to death and then it loses its mystery. But we still have 35 minutes to go, so. But ultimately what I am trying to communicate with this body of work is the beautiful but futile act of trying to hold on to a memory or recall an experience. So I love this quote by Joyce Hilfner. Life is made up of a few moments all strung together like pearls. Each moment is a pearl, and it is up to us to pick the ones with the highest luster. I tend to think that those moments of highest luster are kind of the ordinary and everyday mundane things that we encounter in our lives. I think that's where the richness is held. A meal, a conversation, a tree, a road trip. All of these for me in the studio become moments for contemplation and celebration. But the present quickly becomes the past, and those moments quickly become memories. So the body of work that I make, and some of it is in the gallery, I hope you've had a chance to go take a look, and if not, I'll be there afterwards, is an exploration of how these memories exist within us and the role memory plays when we recall them. So I started grad school when I was 6, or when I was 6, yeah, when my son was 6, as a prodigy, yeah. And this photo was taken a few months before we moved to the Midwest. And grad school kept me away from home for long hours, and I found myself missing him and also wanting to pin down these moments that were just flying by at lightning speed. And during these years, I found that as much as I tried, much of what I was experiencing in motherhood was a desire to pin down the present, but finding that it really only existed in the past. And so I ended up looking at these kind of moments through the lens of memory. And because of this, I really wanted to understand memory, not only the science of how it works, but kind of how we experience it in our lives. I love this photo too because it shows my son and I's still favorite pastime when we're back on the coast of looking for sea glass and shells or like the perfect rock. And it also relates to how I think about memory and how I think memory functions, because there's this constant search for something that's being obscured and revealed and moved by outside forces. So in my research in memory, and it's kind of common knowledge now because this was years ago, what I came to understand then, now, that memory is not like a filing cabinet. It operates more like a game of telephone, where that original message gets altered over time, every time that you tell it. On a scientific level, memory is actually a protein that's stored in your brain. And when we remember something, that protein's reactivated in your brain. And when it's reactivated, that's when it's susceptible to change. And so that means that every time we're remembering something, that it has this chance to get altered by things that are in the present. So essentially, like this quote says, memory is not a poet, or memory is a poet, it's not a historian. It means that memories change, and they're constructed and they're reconstructed time and time again every time we recall them. Like really when you're remembering something, you're remembering the last time that you remembered it, right? Not that kind of original instance. So I find myself in some tension, because there's that girl who grew up in cemeteries and in the funeral home who completely understands that nothing lasts. And there's the mom in me, the human in me, that wants those moments to last forever. And I want to be able to pin them down, and I want to make them stay. And I think my work is trying to balance both of those ideas, kind of being the poet and the historian. The historian wants moments to last forever and takes hundreds and hundreds of phone photos trying to capture all those little moments. And then the poet calls through all of those images and those moments and those experiences to find those little pearls to celebrate and build work around. So this is a detailed shot of work that's in the gallery titled Culch. And I think a lot of people think it's a typo and think it should be clutch, but it is Culch. And the reason it's Culch is because a Culch is a mass of stones, broken shells, grit on which an oyster bed is formed. And just as a side note, oysters are my all-time favorite food ever, because essentially when you are eating them, you're eating a healthy ecosystem because they kind of pick up all of the environment and they're a filtration system. So anyway, tangent. But when you're farming oysters, a culch is laid down on the ocean floor on the bed to make areas where new oysters can grow and hatch. So this metaphorical oyster bed for this piece was based on a memory that I have of my dad when I was living back in New Hampshire. We were both so exceptionally broke But we had decided to get together for dinner at my place. And when the doorbell rang, he and my stepmom burst through the door with like literally a dozen lobsters and a case of Budweiser. And we feasted like kings that night, and we ate lobster for days, and it was amazing. And what I will always remember about that night is like laughing until we cried. Empty Budweiser cans just littering the kitchen, along with a coating of lobster pot water, like that coated the entire floor. After dinner was over, I had to mop. My husband's shaking his head. Yeah, he remembers too. It was amazing. And I only found out years later that he had actually overdrawn his bank account to buy that meal. So I didn't know that until later. And I don't know about your parents, but my dad, one of his love languages is food for sure. It's probably where I get some of my relationship with food. And eating out with him is like one of my favorite things to do, because he will literally order the restaurant and we just like feast. It's amazing. I think he grew up with a lot of scarcity, and his pushback against that is abundance. It's really fun. So the historian's recollection of that night and that dinner is on the left. Of course, I had to snap a photograph, and then the poet is on the right. And that's how I try to think about my ceramic assemblages, is from this poet's mind. Like, what else can I bring in and build off of that original experience? And what is kind of informing the present space that I'm in and want to bring to the work? So I love Rebecca Solnit. She's one of my favorite writers. And she has some really beautiful thoughts on memory and how it works. She says, memory, even in the rest of us, is a shifting, fading, partial thing. A net that doesn't catch all the fish by any means, and sometimes catches butterflies that don't exist. And again, this is just, we see memory as poet, you know, where you're continually encountering the unexpected. Okay, so moving on to still life. I was recently asked by a friend what inspires the objects that I use in my work. So I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about my influence of traditional still life painting. I love looking through these like seemingly mundane collection of objects to kind of decipher what the symbolism is and to learn about the objects that these people collected. And of course, like so many Memento Mori and Vanitas paintings have that like religious immorality undertone. I'm not interested in that in my work. But what speaks to me is how they're using those objects to convey the fleeting nature of life. And so for my own work, I almost want the opposite, right? That I want the viewer to slow down and actually enjoy the present in the moment with this amount of abundance. Still life also is just a really good reminder that sometimes a collection of objects that are close to us are worthy of celebrating and deserving of our attention. And artists throughout the years, I mean, you guys know, have turned their attention to still life as a way to express ideas about the self. So Peter Klaas's Vanitas still life from 1625 might be familiar to a lot of you guys. In it are those like very recognizable symbols that reference the passing of time and fleeting nature of life: the skull, the cut flower, burning candle, etc. So a lot of times you'll see kind of these direct references in my work. So in this piece called Brood 10, there are skulls, flowers, berries, that like decaying fruit, mirror balls, and even the color palette sometimes references that traditional still life painting. So flower paintings are another genre of still life that I find myself drawn to, and also like they are seemingly factual, but they really are fiction. So again, like this work of the poet versus the work of the historian. So this is a Rachel Royce still life with flowers, and it looks utterly convincing because it looks like it's based in realism, but any seasoned gardener could tell you that these flowers don't all bloom at the same time. Lupin and tulips and swamp lilies, and they all bloom at different times throughout the summer. So yeah, this, especially at the time it was painted, this particular arrangement could have never existed at the time it was painted. Now it's a little different because Rachel Royce, actually she was the daughter of a scientist's father who had an anatomy collection. He was really good at preserving things, so she became a master of preserving these flowers, and so she did have dried versions of these. But that wasn't always the case. A lot of times these painters would start a painting and then wait a little bit till the next flower bloomed and then add it in. So they are this sort of accumulation of time as well. And then last thing that kind of informs the objects in the work and the way that I think about including them is I love this book, The Rhetoric of Perspective by Annika Grutenboer, and I discovered in that traditional letter rack paintings, like you see on the right, often included specific objects that were only known to and able to be identified by the person who was painting them or the person who was receiving them. They were almost like secret codes, or even sometimes self-portraits. I find that really inspiring. There's just so many layers to these paintings that just seem like kind of a random collection of objects. There are a couple contemporary still life artists that I look to and are inspired by, and you might be familiar with some of these guys. So Beth Littman is a glass artist who creates these large, like pronged still lifes out of glass, and she's got a piece that's permanently installed at the Wichita Art Museum. So if you ever find yourself in Wichita, she's got work there. I think I own a couple of her pieces, but only one is on display right now. And then Laura Latinsky, who is a photographer out of Chicago, who kind of approaches still life and memory in similar constructive ways to the way that I think about my work, and whose color palette I just drool over. I just love the way that she uses color in this work. So a lot of times I'm referencing this kind of symbolism indirectly, like pulling these images or objects of cut flowers and timepieces and fruit and vegetables, but there have been bodies of work that I've done that actually reference kind of specific still life paintings. So I want to show you a few of those. And these are all sort of small scale work, so much smaller than you see up on the screen. So Vanitas with Pear after Vander Ass, so kind of pulling from that composition that he's using and abstracting some of the imagery found in there. Just a detail shot of that work. Vanitas with Basket after a Ruysch painting. Same thing, color palette and composition, you know, not directly referencing per se. And then still life with letter as well. And then to kind of end this section of still life conversation, the following works that I want to show you are self-portraits that I made during a 2-week residency at Truro Center for the Arts, which is way out on the tip of Cape Cod, surrounded by the national seashore. It is absolutely incredible. I got to spend 2 weeks there in 2021 making work, and it was May 2021. Everyone had just gotten their second COVID shot. We were all kind of re-emerging from the isolation of COVID, and I was the only singular artist staying on this campus. It was actually like both beautiful and kind of a lonely time. So I found myself making these small collections of works that relate to the letter rack as self-portrait, but that are drawing from this Peter Class still life. I took this painting and I made little contour line drawings out of ceramic, and you can see some of them up there. So these little tiny extruded drawings that kind of hang on a nail next to the piece, pulled directly from this Peter Claus painting. Outside the studio at the time, at the residency, there were just daffodils blooming everywhere, so some of that's kind of incorporated in the work. That particular residency, like within 5 minutes of anywhere, there's a beach that you can walk on. So I got to walk along the coast every day, and I was really drawn. Like the light quality in Cape Cod is unlike anything I've ever experienced too, because it's essentially a peninsula, right, surrounded by on 3 sides of water. So it just reflects off of the buildings and the objects in a really specific way. So I did a lot of painting of the rocks that were on the beach, and the feathers that I would find, and all this like cast off debris that I would find and incorporated into these little self-portraits. Back to the mind map, onto porcelain, right? So why clay? And why specifically porcelain? And I remember, and you guys are in school too, I remember having to answer this question time and time again in grad school. And what I really wanted to say was because I love it. From the first time I touched that material when I was in high school, like I just never looked back. It was just the material that I felt drawn to. But that answer doesn't suffice in school, right? So the answer that helps kind of give context to the work and why it's important to the work that I make is that porcelain has a really deep and rich history in preciousness and desire and containment And I think a lot of artists come to the material through vessel making, and vessels are essentially just vehicles for containment, right? In the same way that like, I just want to hold and hang on to these moments. Like there's a real relationship between the material and the vessel and the ideas that I was working with. And so I'm not a vessel maker, right? I don't make work in that way, but I love that connection. I love that material connection between ceramics and containment. Porcelain in particular has its own history that would take an entire other lecture to cover, so I'm not going to go into that now, but it's got a lot of dualities that I really am drawn to. It's fragile and delicate, but it's also really strong. It's one of the stronger clay bodies out there. The chunky plates that you come across in diners, the toilet that you sit on, that really expensive bone china, all porcelain. It can be used in liquid and solid states. It's an object of desire, yet it's often commonly found around our home. It really embodies this like both precious and profane, and I love that. You know, any good work I think has tension. It's like I like that tension between the two. But fragility also means that it's breakable, and there are lots of broken shards in my work. Yeah, you probably have seen that if you've seen the gallery. So I joke that like most artists are really sad when they open a kiln and it's just like in a million pieces, but most of my work goes into the kiln that way, in a bunch of shards. So yeah, this is often a scene around my studio, just piles of debris. I'm also a huge consumer of podcasts, so I have a 40-minute commute to work. I love to listen to them when I drive or when I'm in the studio, and I think it's kind of funny how the universe just sometimes sends you the right podcast at the right time. And so recently, this came to me from Brene Brown's Unlocking Us podcast, and she was interviewing author Susan Cain, who wrote Bittersweet most recently, which is a book that explores how we hold these opposing emotions in one space, the bitter and the sweet. And I heard this episode at a time that I was going through with my family, the decline of my stepmom, who was kind of at the end of her 2-year battle with cancer. And the interview just came at the right time. It was just kind of like a balm to where I was at personally and kind of in my studio practice at the time. So in this podcast, she references the Kabbalah, which is a mystical branch of Judaism, and the importance of oppositions kind of being in conversation with each other. And I don't want to butcher the quote that kind of made me stop in my tracks when I was making in the studio. So I have it here and I'm just going to read it because I think it's beautiful. It says, "The teaching that I love is originally that everything was one unified divine vessel. It was all light, but then the divine shards of light scattered all around us. They're buried all around us everywhere you look. And the task in life is to pick up the buried shards wherever you can find them." And I was working and I heard this and I thought, yes, this is why I really like that duality of brokenness and wholeness in my work. It's kind of what I've been feeling, but I haven't been able to put words to. I'm like, those are the words, I love that. Because really, like, I'm trying to cull through that debris and detritus of the everyday and just find those sacred shards and try to reconstruct them, right? Like, that's life, right? Like, you're constantly searching for those moments of sacredness, and you're leaving behind moments of your own in stories and fragments and slivers of those divine moments. So out of that came this work, and this is also in the show. It's called Sun Shower. And it's an ode to that duality, kind of made during this particularly difficult time in my family when I was just like so deep in the trenches of grief, and also like having some of the sweetest, most beautiful moments with my family kind of both at the same time. So it's sort of like a sun shower, right? It's like raining and shining sun at the same time. And buried amidst the debris, nestled in that little netting at the bottom, is a poem, back to poetry, by Ada Limon, titled "Late Summer After a Panic Attack." And just a little snippet towards the end, I won't read the whole thing, but it just says, "Beetle on wainscoting, dead branch breaking, but not breaking, stones from the sea next to stones from the river, unanswered messages like ghosts in the throat, a siren whining high toward town, repeating that the emergency is not here, repeating that this loud silence is only where you live." I just want to sit with that a minute. It's really this beautiful ode to where I was at in the moment. Sometimes work is cathartic that way. So intermingled with the material is how I use the material, which is sometimes like a little hard to pin down because it's all over the place. And Jen maybe knows when she has to do a workshop, and I'm like, but what? I don't know. So to work in memory is to work in creation and destruction, to build and destroy and to reconstruct and to kind of work with those fragments and wholeness. So this is a shot of my studio and the bench on which I do just about all of my building of my parts. So I make everything individually and then fire them in the kiln and then build with them later. And the question I get asked most often is like, how long does it take to build a piece? Which is impossible to answer because of the way that I work. I really can't settle on like one specific way of working with material. I truly love all things ceramic. I do, except for throwing. I really love throwing. That's okay, I gotta do it, teach it. But I usually make in cycles. So like I'll spend a week hand building parts, another week slip casting molds, or another week dipping objects. And I'm just usually kind of in this constant state of just making these small parts. And my studio really does look like a color-coordinated hoarder's lair. It's just like boxes of color-coordinated things everywhere. So sometimes there are parts that I make that I don't use for years, that I'm just like waiting for the right piece to show up to kind of plug it in. So when it's time to build my work, I just lay all of the parts out on tables, kind of working in the color palette that I've selected, and then I get to work attaching them to a panel. So I attach everything to a wooden panel through tile glue piped through a frosting bag. Sometimes I work with the panels when they're flat, sometimes I work with them up on the wall. When I was younger, I wanted to be both an architect and a cake decorator. So I feel like this way of working, I don't know, it just makes me so happy. I just like working that way. So that's how the work is kind of literally made. So sometimes I'll spend weeks in hand-built flowers or abstract shapes. A lot of times when I'm in this part of the process, when I'm hand-building the work, I'm working intuitively. So I'm making flowers from memory. Sometimes I reference specific flowers, but not usually. I don't know about you, but my process needs to fit into my life. So this part of the process of just like sitting and kind of contemplative making just really works amidst the chaos of my teaching load and the commute and the studio practice and being a mom and all of that. So definitely there are stretches where I just like to veg out and listen to podcasts or watch movies or watch shows while I'm still keeping my hands busy. So literally there are afternoons I'll just sit down and like repetitively roll like a little pile of balls, or there was a couple weeks not too long ago that I just spent a week making individual pine needles just to like, I don't know, there's something meditative about that repetition, just I'm drawn to. But I also slip cast and press mold, so there are stretches also where I'm doing that in my studio. So every piece usually has a specific object that I'm using within that piece that relates to the particular memory or the person and place. So for example, this is an object that I used in tide pools, which is in the gallery. And it was really important for me to use horseshoe crabs because of their relationship to cancer research. So the blood of a horseshoe crab not only can detect cancer, but there's also hope that its properties might be able to inhibit the growth of cancer cells, which is really cool. So this particular piece was commissioned by the April Sampson Cancer Center, which is being built up in Lincoln, Nebraska, to hang in their research room. And it just came at the most meaningful time. My stepmom, who is only 50, I think I mentioned she lost her battle with cancer this last spring, right in the middle of when I was getting started on this piece. So it was just a really nice place to put my energy and my grief and my love for her, kind of process that in the studio a little bit. And she also was from New Hampshire, and so this specific object was really kind of important in a lot of ways. Not only that, where we were living when I lived back east was just a few miles from one of the few breeding grounds of horseshoe crabs. And again, like every May, you would go out to Adams Point, you would see like just hundreds of horseshoe crabs in their mating ritual. So another nod to kind of specificity of time and place. And in that piece too are butterflies, as that symbolic nod to transformation. And you know, not only like those folks like my mom who've passed from the disease, but it really affects everyone who comes into contact with someone who's battling. So you know, everyone's going through a transformation of sort, whether it's the person who's battling or the family system that they're in. Okay. And dipping, which we got to do a little bit of today. So I also dip objects and fire them, and what that means is that original object is burned out and that porcelain coating hardens and stays and fires in. And it just is a transformation that's such a beautiful metaphor to me. And the most frequent object that I find myself dipping are artificial flowers. So growing up at a funeral home and just being also a gardener myself, I'm just really drawn to the floral. And growing up with a gravedigger dad, I know that in the ditches of cemeteries, because of the wind, there are cast off artificial flowers that I just go and collect and bring back to the studio to dip. And I actually really love that they were once a part of that kind of conversation as a memorial in that space as well. And there's only been one time where that resulted in a spider infestation in my studio. We brought home flowers that had a spider nest in there, and yeah, not a good time. But I'm not above dipping anything. So if it's absorbent and it has been like part of a meaningful experience in my life, I will usually like squirrel it away and try to dip it. So it's everything from natural debris, cicadas, leaves, moss, articles of clothing, scraps of fabric, animal crackers, Cheez-Its, a few leftover dinner rolls, really anything. I'm really drawn to objects that are like a specific time and place, whether that's generally or just even kind of within my own experience. And so
How many leftovers have you dipped?
Not a ton, but enough. Yeah. Or I'm making molds of them. Yeah, from white oyster dinners or lobster dinners. So yeah, if it's not dipped, it might be used in other ways. Cicadas, such a meaningful object to me because they are like the sound of summer, right, in Kansas. They have really specific life cycles, times of emergence. You know, I use them a lot in my work, and I recently found out that the females are the only ones that make the noise, right? And they are, it's so interesting, they're louder than an ambulance, which, yeah, that resonates. So for me personally, cicadas are objects that I collect when I'm out on walks in my neighborhood, and a crazy person carrying like the KMUW coffee cup and picking them off the trees and using them in the work. This was a piece, a photograph that I sent my husband a couple years ago when we had to spend our anniversary apart. He is often on those walks with me, and so these are the accumulation of time over the walks of the cicadas that we collected. So some of these cicadas I think are in the tide pool piece in the gallery. So Love Letter to My River is also a work in the show and uses some of those really meaningful dipped objects as well. So I made this piece shortly after my son came out as trans, and it was a really big moment for our family of three. There was a lot of uncertainty and really big emotions, and I wanted to kind of honor him during that time by making him a love letter. So there are objects that are in there that are his. These are his batting gloves he was wearing when he hit his first, and turns out only home run in softball, and not because he was not capable of hitting home runs, he definitely was, but it ultimately became really just too emotional for him to play a predominantly female sport, so he left that behind. So I used that object. That twisted tree root system that you see kind of growing along streams and rivers were all of his old t-shirts that I cut up and twisted and used in that way. I think there's an old sports bra in there too. And then these little pieces of writing, right, that are just telling him to be brave and that I love him and to not be afraid because it's just a lot of uncertainty. Behind the piece is a consistent black line made out of opaque black glass. That's the aerial view of the Lamprey River that we were living on when he was born. And so this piece really is like specific to my river and is specific to rivers as a whole, which are like constantly moving and changing. Said, right, you can't ever dip your toe into the same river twice. It's always full of different water, but it's the same river. Just love that metaphor. Okay, we're closing in on it, you guys. guys. So I've shared a lot about my background, my ideas, process, materials. So I just want to take you now really quickly through kind of a more emotional way I think about building the work and how I kind of go from memory to kind of physicalized piece. So this is a detail shot of a piece called Walking the Pine Forest to Ballston Beach, and it was one of those that came out of that residency in Cape Cod. A lot of times I'm making work about things in the past, so it was a year or so before I kind of tackled this piece. So what do you remember about a place? Do you remember how it feels to walk the earth made soft through years of built up pine needles? Do you remember the crunch the needles make underfoot, the fresh resinous scent of pine, that really specific way the light slices through the needles as you walk, the sunshine dancing off the deep blue ocean water at the end of the trail, how cherries are best in June, how you'd grab a towel and a book and a bag of cherries and spend hours soaking up the sun with gulls and waves drowning everything else out. It's just an ode to that personal time that I spend in that environment. Oops. There we go. Another piece that I finished up this year, Ode to a Dogwood. I've been thinking about these recent works as odes, which is a type of lyric poetry. It's usually sung, but it praises an event or an individual and kind of uses that language of nature and aspects of nature. There we go. Do you have a favorite tree? Because mine is a dogwood. Because of its beautifully twisted branches, because it grows under the shade of taller, bigger trees, because of its showy spring flowers that arrive early when you're pining for spring's warmth. If you were to travel with me to New Hampshire, I could drive you to the exact spot of my favorite dogwood tree. So some dogwoods actually don't produce showy blooms, and I wonder if they are jealous of their flowering cousins. I have both in my backyard now, the unflowering and flowering kind. So I made molds of my unflowering dogwood leaves and I painted on flowers for them so they wouldn't be jealous of this piece. Okay, so to end, I just want to share just a couple little side projects that don't always kind of make it into the gallery spaces, mostly because you guys are students and just like to share the breadth of the way that I think. So the work that I make that's in the gallery is really physical and time consuming. It takes a long time to make. I also need some more immediate ways of working through ideas and ways of working that are not so physically demanding on my body. So I started this series of postcards a few years back because a lot of my work has this relationship between object and image. And I go back and forth kind of feeling like I'm either a ceramic artist or a painter. I think I kind of land somewhere in between. But when I was thinking about like reducing down my format to smaller, I thought about the idea of postcards because they're that quintessential like object of memory. So I started making ceramic postcards, kind of commemorating the places that I would travel to, and they're small, so I can travel with them as well. You know, I like process. I've talked a lot about it. So I'm also kind of trying to develop the underglaze watercolors, and they make them, but the color palette's really limiting. So I'm trying to develop this watercolor system that I can use in a little pan to take with me to travel with, to just keep working and not have to make work that's so physically demanding and carry my studio with me. And sometimes my husband collaborates with me because he's also a writer, so they're a way for us to work together. So I will do the image and he will do the writing of our travels on the back, which is really lovely. And then lastly, ceramic Post-it notes as another, just like a Post-it note's a reminder, right? It's a externalized, physicalized part of your brain. And a couple summers ago, I got really sick and I couldn't be in the studio. And it's like, how am I going to still make work when I can't like physically be out making? And so I just would do these daily drawings, kind of celebrating these little mundane moments, kind of picking out those photos from the phone and isolating them and celebrating them. I'll just end with this Rebecca Solnit quote that just still so beautifully summarizes how I think about my studio work. You're not carving marble, you're grabbing handfuls of flotsam from a turbulent river. You can arrange the detritus, but you can't write the whole river. That's it. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Or I'm also also going back to the gallery for the reception, and I'm happy to answer questions back there too. Hi, yeah.
So, Trisha, it's really interesting looking at your earlier work. It's so tight, right?
Yeah.
Really object based. How did you navigate that transition? Because your work now so painterly, so loose.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's really interesting.
That's a great question, because I do battle feeling like overly precious about stuff, and so I really did. I mean, and I gotta credit Ted in grad school, who's like, okay, you know how to do that. What else is in there? So I think there are moments in the current work where I get to be really tight, and then I get to push back against that and be like, no, it really gets to expand more. So I still do it, but not as the main thing. Satisfies that, yeah.
Do you make your own slip molds?
Yes, mostly. And I hate every second of it. No, just kidding. I do.
I've got a question. So, as an educator, when you're teaching, what would be your advice to students to make like cohesive bodies of work?
Make a lot of it and edit down. I don't know. I think that would be my advice. Just make. Yeah, just make. I don't know. It's like, I mean, no, truly, like sometimes I don't know that it's a cohesive body of work until I have some time away from the work that I make to see how it all relates, right? It's like, oh, okay, so now I can see how that fits in to the rest of the work that I feel like is kind of my main body of work. But I don't know that until I've both made and had just a little bit of distance from it. Yeah.
A question. So a lot of your work is it has a lot of detail, and it has a lot of things to look at. Do you consider your process more freeform and do whatever looks and feels good, or do you see it in your head and just, is it really specific in your head what you're doing?
It is definitely more freeform, and one of the scariest moments is when I'm confronted with that blank canvas. It's like, you gotta make that first move. And then I feel like after I make that first move, then I'm responding to the part that I just put down. So yeah, it is pretty intuitive. I mean, I've got my color palette. I'd say my objects, my color palette, that's all pretty resolved before I start, but how the composition is gonna be is definitely more freeform.
One aspect that I really liked about your stuff was the little like window sections that you can look into. That's kind of, it reminds me of like an eyeball in a way, and it showed up in a bunch of different pieces that were in the gallery. Do you have like what would you say describes those sections of the piece? Just a little piece that comes around and has a little window to look inside. What's the importance of that?
I think that's evolved over the years. I think when I first started doing that, it was a real literal way to talk about the objects that are buried under water. It came out of a piece, I think, originally that was really referencing a specific coastal beach that I used to walk, and I just wanted something that created a little bit of barrier behind the objects that were kind of more out in front. And then I think in some pieces they function as resting places for the eye. I think in some places they function as a reflective mirror surface. So it's evolved over the years. I think that in different works, they function in different ways.
What has been your favorite piece that you've created?
I don't know that I have a favorite. I think one of the more meaningful ones, I think, was Love Letter to My River, just because of its connection to family. Yeah. So I guess if I had to pick one.
You have like a lot of little pieces on all your canvases. Are you ever worried about it like falling off and breaking? Just looking at those pictures so good.
Yes and no. Yeah, the big pieces, so I use tile glue, the same kind of glue that you would use to hang tiles on your shower. And the great part about that material is it's got a little bit of flexibility to it, so that if the canvases torque a little bit, the objects still stay embedded. That being said, fragments are gonna fall off. There are little bits and shards that are probably always just gonna let go and fall to the floor, especially if it's hung on a wall that has a door. It gets slammed and notice that things tend to fall on the ground. So I trust my material, but I also know that like things happen. Every time I install, I have to repair a little bit. The big stuff anyway.
Another thing that I really liked about your stuff was the repeated forms across the separate pieces. So like a little bottle I may see in one part of the room, and then I'm all the way over, I'm like, oh hey, it's that same shape of bottle. Is there any form that you try to put in like every single work, like as a little Easter egg, just one of them or anything like that?
I mean, I feel like most of my forms have that little skull in there somewhere as that nod to the memento mori. I don't think about making in that way, but there are probably objects that, I mean, there are definitely like objects that are part of my visual vocabulary that show up in a lot of the work, but I don't know that I consciously think about that. But if I had to pick one, the skull definitely shows up a lot.
When you were talking about encasing and firing the artificial flowers, like, is there any fumes that happen in the kiln from that?
Yeah, there are. I fire them outside. Yeah, you don't go anywhere near the kiln where it's firing, and you fire outside. Yeah. I was telling the students who were dipping today, 90% of the time I fire outside. Every once in a while I'll run into a time crunch and I have to fire at home in my kiln at home, and it really relegates me to not being in my studio for a couple of days because the fumes linger. It's not good. All right, well, thank you so much again, and I am happy to visit with you about any questions you might have a little later in the gallery.
To support the ESU Art Forum program, please visit emporia.edu/art. Click on the Events tab, scroll down to the Art Forum link and click. Then scroll down to the Support Art Forum button and click. Finally, choose your donation level and click on the Continue button to complete the process. We appreciate your support.